When you hear the word mystery, you may think of a thrilling novel or a detective in a plaid coat solving a murder. But it is the real-life mysteries, the serial killers, murders, kidnappings, and disappearances that make those imaginary worlds a frightening reality. On March 22, 1977, Charles, or Chuck Morgan, left his home to go to work as an escrow company owner. He kissed his wife and daughters goodbye and waved as he pulled out of the driveway. But their goodbyes were thought to be final when Chuck didn't return home for 3 days. His wife and daughters were frantic with worry, unsure where Chuck was and if he would ever return. But after those 3 long days, Chuck's wife, Ruth, was startled awake in the middle of the night by the sound of her dog barking. She threw on her robe, rushed down the stairs, and opened the door. There, in the doorway, was Chuck. One shoe missing, plastic handcuffs on one of his ankles and one of his wrists, confused and silent. Ruth stood at the door confused, asking him questions about where he'd been. But still, Chuck stood completely silent. He gestured to his throat, trying to communicate that he could not speak. Ruth asked if he could write, and he slowly nodded yes. Eager to hear an explanation, Ruth immediately found a paper and pen and sat with Chuck as he began writing his story. In his writings, he shared that he was kidnapped and managed to escape from his captors, who had beaten him near Phoenix's Sky Harbor Airport. But he shared no names or specific information about the captors. He only referred to the criminals as them. He wrote about why he was unable to speak. The kidnappers had tortured him, painting his throat with a hallucinogenic drug that, if he spoke too soon, could either drive him to insanity or destroy his nervous system and kill him. Ruth looked over his shoulder while he was writing, her fear growing as he dove deeper into the story. She demanded he go to the doctor to be examined and to go to the police immediately, but Chuck was hesitant, adamant that if he did, it would lead to their deaths. Ruth could see the fear in his eyes when he wrote that he was afraid the whole family would be murdered, so she complied with his wishes. Over the next week, Ruth nursed Chuck back to health. Before regaining his ability to speak, he began to hint to her that he had been working undercover for the federal government for the previous 3 years. "They took my treasury identification," he told her, referring to his captors. Ruth stood in shock as Chuck shared this. Her husband, a secret agent? She'd never suspected this from him. Although this behavior was sometimes odd, she never thought he was an overly secretive man. At the time of his kidnapping in the 1970s, the Mafia in Arizona ran a narcotics pipeline and served as a threshold for money laundering, with over 500 racketeers beginning operations. Arizona allowed land purchasing through blind trust accounts, making it significantly easier to launder money without a trace. But who was the person that knew who the landowners were? The escrow agents. For example, Chuck Morgan. As an escrow agent, Chuck had done work for at least 2 mafia families purchasing land. He also helped buy metals, gold, and platinum to establish a more convenient way of laundering money. He mentioned something about money laundering to Ruth in passing, but did not imply that he was involved in any way. "The fewer the girls, and you know, the better you will be," he would repeat when Ruth continued to ask questions. His paranoia grew more intense as time went on following his kidnapping. He was sure that something would happen, that he was still in danger, or that his family was in trouble. He tried altering his appearance by growing out his facial hair and always wore a bulletproof vest underneath his clothes. He wouldn't let his wife or daughters go outside alone and insisted he drive his daughters to and from school. Chuck assured his family, "If anything ever happens to me, I will leave a letter explaining everything to you." But little did he know, he wouldn't have a chance to. 2 months following his initial kidnapping, Chuck went missing. Ruth drove the girls to school while Chuck went to work. Although still paranoid about the danger he and his family may be in, he was growing more relaxed and allowed Ruth to drive the children. He had even planned an evening outing with Ruth to attend a Masonic meeting. Curiously, Chuck's last known communication was a call from a downtown payphone to his office, saying he would arrive in 30 minutes. Chuck never came into the office that day. Ruth panicked for her husband and daughters for the next 9 days, unsure of whether or not to call the police because of the extreme fear Chuck had expressed about his family's safety after his first kidnapping. It was 9 days later, Ruth received a phone call from an unidentified woman. She referred to herself as Green Eyes and told Ruth, Chuck is alright, and everything will be alright. Ecclesiastes 12, verse 1 through 8. 2 days later, Charles's body was found near his car on a dirt road 40 miles west of his home. There was a bullet to the back of his head that traveled all the way through his skull and settled between his teeth. Although he'd been overly prepared with his change of appearance, bulletproof vest, and weapons on his person at all times, it still wasn't enough. He had been shot with his own .357 caliber Magnum firearm, which was found nearby and wiped of all fingerprints. When the police searched the scene, they found ammunition, multiple weapons, and several sets of handcuffs hidden in the car. Hidden in a tissue, the officers found one of his teeth. They also found a map with directions to the murder site and a $2 bill with 7 Spanish names and Ecclesiastes 12 verses 1 through 8 written on it. This was the second time in Chuck's case that Ecclesiastes was mentioned, and the woman who made the mysterious phone call to Ruth came forward. She told them that she and Chuck Morgan had known one another and saw him after his first appearance. According to the woman, Chuck showed her a briefcase stuffed with money that he was planning to use to pay off a hitman who was hired to kill him. He told the woman, who referred to herself as Green Eyes, that he had a $90,000 hit on him that was rising $5,000 every day. The investigators confirmed that Morgan and Green Eyes met from CCTV footage, but they also had met several times at a Southside hotel between his first disappearance and his death. Not long after his death, Chuck Morgan's attorney, Ronald Newman, also confirmed that Chuck had testified in a state investigation for the banking department against Tuckson's Banco Internal de Arizona. Lurking behind every corner, there was still fear for Ruth and her girls. Although Chuck had died, they still weren't sure if they were safe. After his death, Chuck's impounded car was broken into while still in police possession, and his office was ransacked. Several weeks after his death, Ruth heard a knock at the door. She unlocked it and slowly opened it to find 2 men. They claimed to be in the FBI, searching for evidence to help with the case. But these 2 men weren't searching for evidence. They tore apart the houses they were searching for the mysterious object, but it was never found. Chuck Morgan's death, although mysterious, was ruled as a suicide and closed on August 10, 1977. Men are afraid of a high place and tears on the road. Remember him before the silver cord is broken and the golden bowl is crushed. Then the dust will return to the earth as it was, and the spirit will return to God who gave it. Ecclesiastes 12, verses 1 through 8. On April 26, 1964, Paul Joseph Fronczak was born. His mother, Dora, held him close, cooing at her beautiful newborn son. She nursed him throughout the day when he wasn't in the nursery with the other newborns and felt so excited to be his mother. The following day, the door opened to Dora's room, and a nurse came in, telling her that the doctor wanted to examine Paul. Dora handed Paul to the nurse, hesitant to let her baby go again with a nurse she didn't quite recognize. The nurse left Dora's room and left the hospital, and baby Paul was never seen again. Dora lay in her room. After 20 minutes, 45 minutes, 1 hour, she drifted in and out of sleep, still exhausted from the delivery. Hospital staff quickly realized that Paul was unaccounted for and began frantically searching the entire hospital floor, but the authorities on site didn't notify the police or the baby's parents until that afternoon. At 3 p.m., they called Paul's father, Chester Fransac, at the factory where he operated machinery. When he received the call, Chester felt like he had been struck in the chest. He left immediately, speeding to the hospital to be with his wife and tell her the most horrific news a mother could hear. Her baby was missing. Thus, the largest manhunt in Chicago history was launched. In the conducted search, 175,000 postal workers, 200 police officers, and the FBI pursued the kidnapper or anything that would lead them to find Paul. They searched 600 homes by midnight that night, but were unsuccessful. As the search continued, the Fransacs lay in their hospital room for a week, panicking for their new son's safety. When they finally returned home, the press captured their teary eyes and exhausted movements as they walked to their front door. But despite all the publicity, there were no credible leads. Paul seemingly vanished into thin air, and the investigation was at a standstill. 2 years passed with no discoveries. Dora and Chester tried to move on, but couldn't get over the loss of their son, so they were baffled and overjoyed when they received a letter from the FBI about a possible sighting. The FBI found a toddler in Newark, New Jersey that matched their son's description. The previous year, the toddler was found abandoned in a stroller at the mall with a black eye. The local law enforcement found the child and was convinced that someone would come to claim him, but hours passed and no one came. They named him Scott McKinley and put him in foster care. Before he found a permanent home, a photo of Scott crossed the desk of a New Jersey detective who recognized the young boy. He thought that Scott might be Chester and Dora's long-lost baby, but the FBI had little to go off of when the investigation was reopened. Since he was taken so soon after being born, his blood type was unknown, he had no fingerprints taken, and was only in a single photograph. From the photo, they could see that, at most, the shape of Paul's ear in the picture matched Scott's. To narrow down the possibility that Paul and Scott were identical, the FBI tested over 10,000 boys, and Scott was the only child they thought could be Paul. But the FBI didn't make the final decision. 3 months later, they called Dora and Chester with the news, and after some serious talks, the couple decided to meet him. They entered the building feeling nervous about meeting the child, but somewhat excited at the same time. They were both required to take psychological tests before meeting Scott. But once they did, they were convinced he was their missing son, adopted him instantly, and continued to call him by his birth name Paul. Over the years, they were happy, reunited, and a whole family again. But no good thing can last forever. When Paul was 10, he searched the house for Christmas presents. He crawled into their attic space in search of the gifts, but found old newspaper clippings instead. He paused before glancing over the articles when he saw a headline about a kidnapped young baby named Paul. He brought the clippings to his mom, asking for an explanation, but she only scolded him for his curiosities. "Yes," she said, "you were kidnapped. We found you, we love you, and that's all you need to know." She thought he would be satisfied with their answer and move on. But Paul couldn't forget this disclosure of life-altering information. Were these people actually his mom and dad, or did he really belong with another family? His questions just grew more bothersome the older he got. Paul knew his parents loved him, but they were overprotective, and he quickly grew exhausted of their control. He was sent to a Catholic school with a strict dress code to learn the importance of discipline, but he wanted to listen to his rock music, grow his hair long, and show his individuality. One day it boiled over. He and his mom were arguing over the length of his hair and behavior when Doris shouted, "I wish they'd never found you," and this stuck with Paul. After he graduated high school, Paul moved away from Chicago to play bass in an Arizona rock band. But when the band broke up 5 years later, he moved back home with his parents in Chicago. But he couldn't stand it for long. He got restless and joined the army before moving around and holding over 200 jobs in various industries. When he was finally ready to settle, he chose Las Vegas. He met a woman he loved, got married, and started a family. When his wife was pregnant with their first child, the doctor asked about their family medical histories, and it hit Paul that he didn't know how to answer. He had wondered if he was his parents' son since finding the news clippings in his attic. After all, he was found in a New Jersey mall, nowhere near his parents in Chicago. His parents had another child, Dave, who was so much like his mother and father that he always felt like an outsider. His family was reserved and quiet, but he was spontaneous and loud. They even looked different. Dave looked just like their dad and even behaved like him, but Paul was different. His uncertainty convinced him to purchase an over-the-counter DNA kit in 2012. After he bought the test, his parents came to visit. It was then he brought up his doubts with his mom and dad and asked if they had ever wondered if it was all real. How did they know he was their son? His parents admitted they had wondered over the years and agreed to swab their cheeks and mail the kids. But after his parents arrived home in Chicago, they called him instantly and requested that he not send in the kid. They said they were sure he was their son, and they didn't need any test to prove it. Paul understood their hesitancy and chose not to send the samples. A few weeks later, his curiosity got the better, and he pulled the pieces from his desk drawer where he hid them. He decided to send the samples. He got the call in the morning, at work, a few weeks later. There was no remote possibility that he was Paul, Dora and Chester's missing son. He froze in shock. Everything he knew about himself, his religion, culture, medical history, and even his birthday, was a lie. And he wanted the truth. He wanted to know his real parents. He wanted to know himself. and he wanted to know what happened to the honest Paul. But before mentioning his next steps to his parents, he called the local investigative journalist, George Knapp, for information and talked with the FBI about the case, who were able to find 10 boxes full of original files in Chicago. When the investigation was reopened, a team called the DNA detectives, and they took the case free of charge. Led by a genetic genealogist, C.C. Moore, she and her team were able to use DNA testing, newspaper searches, public records, and phone interviews to find as much information as possible. 2 years later, they finally had some concrete information to share. Paul's real name was Jack Rosenthal, and he was born 6 months earlier than he had always thought. He also had a twin sister, Jill. He needed to know more, so he reached out to his biological family. They told him that he and his sister were neglected and abused by their parents, Gilbert and Marie Rosenthal. Gilbert was a war veteran with PTSD, and his wife Marie was a heavy alcoholic. The children were always crying, and their parents wouldn't help them. Once, a babysitter was at the house and noticed that Jack had a black eye, and their room reeked of urine because their sheets hadn't been changed. Their parents ended up dying in the 1990s from cancer, and Jill had also gone missing. Jack believed something sinister had happened to his sister after he was abandoned and dug in the backyard of Gilbert and Marie's home, but he found nothing. Hi everyone, thank you for watching Unexplained Mysteries. If you enjoyed this video, please like, comment, and subscribe. If you want to see more content like this, please watch our latest video about one of the most evil sons, Jack Gilbert Graham.